Chicago, 1874. The air in the city is a suffocating shroud of coal smoke and the metallic tang of industrial progress. Behind a desk cluttered with coded telegrams and leather-bound ledgers, a man sits in total silence. His name is Allan Pinkerton. To the world, he is the pioneer of modern shadows, the man who thwarted an assassination attempt on Abraham Lincoln, the founder of the most powerful detective agency the world has ever seen. But today, Allan Pinkerton doesn't look like a hero. He looks like a man being consumed from the inside out. On that desk lies the greatest failure of Pinkerton's life, a ghost that gallops through the Missouri plains, mocking the law, robbing banks in broad daylight, and vanishing like mist before the first detective's horse can even be saddled. Pinkerton isn't just chasing a criminal anymore, he is in a war against a symbol. To the railroads, Jesse James is a financial parasite. To the government, he is a rebel who refuses to admit the Civil War is over. But to Allan Pinkerton, to Jesse James is the man who is dismantling his reputation piece by piece. Before we dive into the blood-soaked trail of this obsession, I have a question for you. How far would you go to protect your name? Would you cross the line between justice and murder? Hold that thought, because by the end of this story, the answer might disturb you. If you are fascinated by the hidden dark side of history, make sure you are subscribed to Witness of Silence. We are building a community here for those who prefer the truth over the legend. Now let's look at the moment the hunt turned into a massacre. Imagine the scene. America is a fractured mirror, trying to glue itself back together after the bloodiest war in its history. The railroads are the veins through which the blood of the new economy flows. But in the heart of the country, there is a blockage. The James Younger gang has turned train robbery into a dark art form. They don't just take the gold, they take the dignity of the institutions. When the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific Railroad was derailed in a violent heap of twisted steel, the railroad barons lost their patience. They went to Chicago, knocked on Pinkerton's door, and slid a blank check across the table. "Stop Jesse James," they said, "at any cost." Pinkerton accepted the challenge with the arrogance of a man who had never lost. He believed in logic, in forensic science, and in the sheer weight of organization. He sent his best men into Little Dixie, the region of Missouri where the James family lived. But what Pinkerton failed to understand, and what would cost his agents their lives, is that he wasn't sending men on an investigation. He was sending them into a war zone where the locals saw northern detectives as invaders, and Jesse James as a modern-day Robin Hood. Meet Joseph Witcher. Young, brave, and fatally naive. He believed he could infiltrate the James family farm by posing as a simple laborer looking for work. Pinkerton warned him of the danger, but Witcher had the confidence of those who believe they are invincible. On March 10, 1874, he stepped off a train and walked toward the heart of the enemy's territory. He didn't know it, but the eyes of the neighbors were already tracking his every move. In Missouri, a stranger with clean hands and a city accent was as visible as a wildfire at night. Witcher never made it through the first night. He was captured, not by the law, but by Jesse and Frank James themselves. Imagine the terror of that moment. The agent of the world's greatest agency, now bound and gagged, being interrogated by men who learned their craft during the brutal guerrilla raids of the Civil War. They didn't just want information. They wanted to send a message back to Chicago. The next morning, Witcher's body was found on a lonely road. He had been executed, one bullet in the head, one in the heart. When the news of Witcher's death reached Chicago, something broke inside Allan Pinkerton. The professional hunt died that day. What was born in its place was a blind, suffocating rage. He stopped following the rules. If Jesse James was a ghost, Pinkerton would burn the entire forest down to find him. He was about to cross a line from which no lawman can ever return. But Witcher was only the beginning. Pinkerton had a plan so secret and so violent that it would eventually shock the entire nation and turn a murderer into a martyr. Do you think Pinkerton was justified in seeking revenge for his fallen agent? Tell me in the comments. I want to know where you draw the line between justice and vengeance. Pinkerton began assembling a small army. He was no longer looking for a trial, he was looking for a funeral. But Jesse James was always one step ahead. Every time the Pinkertons closed in, Jesse would leave a mocking note, or a trail of dust, or a dead body. The cat-and-mouse game was escalating toward a night of fire that would change the American West forever. Stay with us, because in the next chapter, we witness the night the Pinkertons finally found the James farm, and the horrific mistake that would haunt Allan Pinkerton until the day he died. The shadows are getting longer, and the real story is only just beginning. Make sure you've liked this video so we can keep bringing these dark truths to light. The death of Joseph Whicher didn't just hurt the Pinkerton agency, it humiliated it. Allan Pinkerton had always prided himself on his eye that never sleeps, but Jesse James had just poked that eye with a hot iron. The air in the Chicago headquarters was no longer thick with professional ambition. It was thick with a cold, calculated fury. Pinkerton knew that as long as the James boys were free, his agency was a laughingstock. But how do you catch a man who is protected by an entire county? Jesse wasn't just a ghost. He was a guest in every farmhouse in Clay County. To the locals, he was the boy who fought back against the Unionists who had burned their crops. To Pinkerton, he was a cancer that needed to be cut out, and if the scalpel didn't work, he would use a sledgehammer. By late 1874, the agency's tactics shifted. They stopped trying to play by the rules of civilian law. They began recruiting special agents, men who were more mercenaries than detectives. These men were shadows in the woods, watchers in the night. They lived in the brush around the James family farm, Castle Rock, observing every movement. They saw Jesse's mother, Zerelda, a woman as fierce and unyielding as any outlaw. They saw his young half-siblings playing in the yard, but they rarely saw Jesse. The pressure was mounting. The railroad companies were breathing down Pinkerton's neck, demanding results for the thousands of dollars they had invested. Every derailed train and emptied safe was a personal insult. It was during this high-tension standoff that the most controversial plan in the history of American law enforcement was born. A plan that was never meant to be written down. A plan for a midnight strike. Before we get to the smoke and the screams of that January night, I want to ask you something. If you were in Pinkerton's shoes, losing your best men and your reputation, would you authorize a strike on a home where women and children slept? It's a question that still divides historians today. If you're finding this deep dive into the darker side of the West compelling, take a second to hit the like button. It helps us keep these forgotten stories alive here at Witness of Silence. The date was January 25th, 1875. The Missouri winter was brutal, a bone-chilling cold that turned the ground into iron. Under the cover of a moonless sky, a group of Pinkerton agents approached the James farmhouse. They weren't there to make an arrest, they were there to end the war. They carried with them an incendiary device, a primitive iron grenade filled with flammable liquid. The plan was simple. Toss the device through the window, smoke the four outlaws out, and cut them down as they ran. They assumed Jesse and Frank were inside, warming themselves by the hearth. They were wrong. The device crashed through the glass, landing in the middle of the kitchen. Zerelda, hearing the glass shatter, rushed into the room, followed by her 8-year-old son Archie. In the confusion of the dark, they thought it was a simple flare or a prank. Reuben Samuel, Jesse's stepfather, tried to shove the smoking object into the fireplace with a fire iron. Then the world exploded. The blast didn't just fill the room with smoke, it filled it with jagged iron and fire. Archie, a boy who had nothing to do with his brother's crimes, was struck in the back. He wouldn't survive the night. Zerelda's right arm was mangled so badly it would later have to be amputated. The agents outside, hearing the screams of a woman and a child instead of the shouts of outlaws, realized their horrific mistake. Jesse and Frank weren't even there. The Pinkertons vanished into the night, but the damage was irreversible. By sunrise, the news had spread like a prairie fire. The great Pinkerton agency had bombed a farmhouse and killed a child. Overnight, the public's perception shifted. Jesse James was no longer just a thief. He was a victim, a man whose family had been mutilated by the monsters from the north. Pinkerton had wanted to destroy the legend of Jesse James. Instead, he had just given it eternal life. He had turned a criminal into a martyr. And in doing so, he made Jesse more dangerous than ever before. Because a man with nothing left to lose is a man who stops looking for an exit and starts looking for a grave. But as the smoke cleared from the farmhouse, a new, even deadlier chapter was beginning. Jesse was no longer just robbing for money, he was robbing for blood. And the next target on his list would lead to the most famous shootout in the history of the frontier. The trail is getting colder, and the stakes are getting higher. If you want to be there when we reveal the true story of the Northfield raid, the heist that broke the gang forever, make sure you've subscribed and turned on notifications. You won't want to miss the next part of this saga, coming very soon. The hunt continues, and as Allan Pinkerton would soon learn, some ghosts are better left unchased. As the dust settled on the scorched remains of the James farmhouse, a shift occurred in the very air of the American West. The Pinkertons had retreated to the shadows of Chicago, nursing their wounds and a shattered reputation, but Jesse James was now a man possessed by a cold, radiating fury. He didn't just want the railroad's money anymore. He wanted their soul. He began to see himself as a soldier in a war that never ended, a guardian of the Southern way of life against the industrial monsters of the North. The James Younger gang reached the peak of its power in the mid-1870s. They were no longer just a group of outlaws. They were a paramilitary force. Their heists became bolder, their escapes more theatrical. They moved through Missouri like kings, protected by a wall of silence from a population that now saw them as victims of northern aggression. But pride, as they say, goeth before a fall. And Jesse's pride was becoming a blinding weight. In the summer of 1876, Jesse decided on a move that would shock even his closest allies. He wanted to hit a target far outside their safe zone in Missouri. He set his sights on Northfield, Minnesota. To me, Jesse, it was a tactical masterstroke, a wealthy bank in a Union-loyal state, a place where they wouldn't expect a group of Southern guerrillas to show up. It was meant to be the ultimate statement of their reach. But as the gang rode north, the omens were dark. The younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, felt the tension. They were hundreds of miles from the brush of Missouri that they knew so well. They were in Yankee territory now, and the people of Minnesota were not the farmers of Clay County. They were veterans of the Civil War too, and they didn't take kindly to strangers with heavy revolvers and long coats. Before we walk into the bloody streets of Northfield, I want to ask you, do you think Jesse's decision to move so far north was a tactical error born of arrogance or a desperate attempt to stay ahead of the law? Your theories help us understand the human side of these legends, so let's discuss it in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into the collapse of an empire, don't forget to subscribe to Witness of Silence. We're just getting to the part that changed the West forever. September 7th, 1876, started as a quiet, ordinary Thursday in Northfield. The residents were going about their business, oblivious to the fact that 8 of the most dangerous men in America were split into groups, quietly surrounding the First National Bank. Jesse, Frank, and Bob Younger entered the bank while the others guarded the street. Inside, they met a man named Joseph. Lee Haywood, the acting cashier. Jesse demanded he open the vault. Haywood, a man of quiet courage, looked into the barrel of Jesse's gun and simply said, "No." He lied, telling them the vault had a time lock and couldn't be opened. Even as they slashed his throat and beat him, Haywood refused to give in. His resistance bought the town something precious: time. Outside, the plan was falling apart. A local citizen named J.S. Allen tried to enter the bank, realized what was happening, and ran through the streets shouting, "Get your guns, boys, they're robbing the bank." The people of Northfield didn't hide. They didn't scream and run. They grabbed their hunting rifles and their old army muskets from their shops and homes. They took positions in second-story windows and behind crates. When the gang members outside tried to clear the streets with warning shots, the citizens of Northfield fired back with deadly precision. The street turned into a slaughterhouse. 2 of the gang members, Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, were knocked off their horses, dead before they hit the dirt. The younger brothers were being riddled with lead. Inside the bank, realizing the heist was a failure, Jesse James did something that defined his darker nature. He turned to the brave cashier, Joseph Hayward, and shot him point-blank in the head. The gang scrambled out of the bank into a hail of bullets. They managed to mount their horses and ride out of town, but they weren't the same men who had ridden in. They were bleeding, exhausted, and hunted. What followed was a 2-week nightmare through the Minnesota wilderness. The younger brothers, wounded and unable to keep up, eventually split from the James brothers. It was a betrayal of the brotherhood that had lasted since the war. Jesse and Frank escaped back to Missouri, disappearing into the shadows once again. But the youngers were not so lucky. After a final, desperate shootout in a swamp called Madelia, the younger brothers were captured, their bodies filled with more lead than most men could survive. The Northfield raid was the funeral of the James Younger gang. The Gato had finally caught the Rato, but it wasn't a detective or a governor who did it. It was a group of ordinary citizens who decided they had enough. Jesse James was back in Missouri, but he was alone. The men he trusted most were in prison or in the ground. The legend was fractured. Jesse was now a king without a kingdom, a ghost without a haunt. And as he tried to rebuild his life under a fake name, the shadows were closing in from a direction he never expected, from within his own circle. Stay with us, because in the next chapter, we look at the quiet years of Mr. Howard and the rising greed of a young man named Robert Ford. The most famous betrayal in history is about to unfold. If you want to see the moment the hunter finally caught the ghost, make sure you've liked this video and are ready for part 4. The story of Jesse James is about to take its darkest turn yet. After the bloodbath in Northfield, the man who was once the most feared outlaw in America became a ghost in his own land. Jesse James didn't just go into hiding. He tried to delete himself from existence. He moved to St. Joseph, Missouri, and took on the name Thomas Howard. He traded his duster and his dual revolvers for the life of a quiet family man. To his neighbors, he was a peaceful, if somewhat private, citizen. To his children, he was simply Papa. But for a man like Jesse, peace was a foreign language. Even as he sat at his dinner table, his eyes were constantly scanning the windows. Every creak of a floorboard, every whistle of the wind through the eaves sounded like the footsteps of a Pinkerton agent or a bounty hunter. He was 34 years old, but his soul was ancient, burdened by the ghosts of everyone he had killed and everyone he had lost. The Gato, the law, had changed its strategy. Governor Thomas Crittenden knew he couldn't catch Jesse James with a frontal assault. Northfield had proven that Jesse was too fast and the Missouri woods were too thick. Instead, Crittenden decided to buy a soul. He put a massive bounty on Jesse's head, dead or alive, and waited for the greed to rot the outlaw's inner circle. He didn't have to wait long. Enter the Ford brothers, Charlie and Robert. They were young, hungry, and far from the battle-hardened veterans Jesse was used to riding with. Robert Ford, in particular, was a different breed. Turf cat. He didn't idolize Jesse for his Southern loyalty. He idolized him for his fame. He wanted to be Jesse James, and if he couldn't be him, he would be the man who ended him. Robert Ford made a secret deal with the governor. The price for Jesse's life? $5,000 and a full pardon. Before we enter that small house on April 3rd, 1882, I have to ask you, in a world of outlaws and killers, who is the true villain? The man who robbed the banks or the friend who waited for him to turn his back? It's a question that has haunted American folk songs for over a century. If you're finding this exploration of betrayal as chilling as I am, make sure you've joined our community at Witness of Silence by hitting that subscribe button. We don't just tell history, we examine the heart of it. By the spring of 1882, Jesse James was becoming desperate. He was running out of money and running out of friends. He invited the Ford brothers into his home, thinking they were the foundation of a new gang. He trusted them with his life, and even more dangerously, he trusted them around his family. On the morning of April 3rd, the air was warm and the house was quiet. Jesse was in a strangely relaxed mood. He took off his gun belt, a rare act for a man who usually slept with a revolver under his pillow. He remarked that the pictures on the wall were dusty. He climbed onto a chair, his back turned to the room, to straighten a framed needlepoint. In that moment, the Gato didn't Strike with a roar, but with a whisper. Robert Ford stepped forward. He didn't call Jesse's name. He didn't give him a chance to draw. He pulled his weapon and fired a single shot into the back of Jesse's head. The sound of the shot shattered the quiet life of Thomas Howard and gave birth to the eternal legend of Jesse James. Jesse fell to the floor, dead before he hit the wood. His wife, Z, rushed into the room, screaming, clutching her husband's cooling body as the Ford brothers scrambled out the door to claim their blood money. Robert Ford expected to be treated as a hero, the man who rid the world of a monster, but he had miscalculated. The public didn't see a hero, they saw a dirty little coward. They saw a man who ate at Jesse's table and then shot him in the back. Ford would spend the rest of his short, miserable life being booed off stages and hunted by the very shadow of the man he killed. But was Jesse's death truly the end of the hunt? Or was it just the moment? The Rato became immortal. Allan Pinkerton was gone. The Youngers were in prison and Jesse was in a grave. But the story was far from over, because a dead outlaw is often much harder to manage than a living one. Stay with us for the final chapter. We are going to look at the strange aftermath of Jesse's death, the fate of the man who shot him, and how the witness of silence finally reveals why we are still talking about this man nearly 150 years later. If you're ready for the conclusion of this epic saga, make sure you've liked the video and checked your notifications. The end of the trail is just ahead. The moment the bullet left Robert Ford's revolver, the man known as Jesse James ceased to be a person and became a myth. But as the Ford brothers fled the house in St. Joseph to collect their bounty, they realized that killing a legend is much harder than killing a man. They had expected the world to celebrate them as the architects of peace, but instead they found themselves cast as the ultimate villains in a new American tragedy. Robert Ford became the dirty little coward of the famous folk song, a man who spent the rest of his days haunted by the very act that was supposed to make him rich. He tried to capitalize on his infamy, touring the country and reenacting the murder on stage for a few coins. But the audiences didn't cheer, they hissed. They threw stones. They saw in Robert Ford the worst kind of betrayal, the kind that strikes from behind, the kind that breaks the sacred bond of hospitality. Eventually, the cycle of violence found him too, in a tent saloon in Colorado, where a man named Edward O'Kelly walked in and ended Robert's life with a shotgun. The hunter had become the hunted, and the ghost of Jesse James had finally claimed its last victim. But while the killers faded into the dust of history, the legend of Jesse James only grew taller. Thousands of people flocked to his funeral. His mother, Zerelda, even began charging tourists to visit the farm and buy pebbles from Jesse's original grave. She was a woman who had lost an arm and a son to the Pinkertons, and she spent her remaining years ensuring that her son's story was told her way, as a story of a Southern hero driven to crime by a heartless government. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning of this journey. Was Jesse James a monster or a protector? Was he the Robin Hood of the West, or a cold-blooded psychopath who used a political cause to justify his love for the gun? The truth, as always, lies in the silence between the records. He was a man of his time, a product of a brutal war that stripped away the humanity of everyone involved. He was a devoted father who taught his children to be kind, even as he was planning his next murder. He was a man who loved his family, but brought fire and lead to the families of others. History is rarely a straight line of good and evil. It is a messy, blood-stained map of choices and consequences. Allan Pinkerton tried to use the science of the future to catch a man of the past, and in his obsession, he lost his own moral compass. Jesse James tried to live in a world that no longer existed, and in his pride, he lost his life. Both men were trapped in a cycle of cat and mouse that neither could truly win. I want to thank you for sticking with us through this 30-minute journey into the darkest corners of the American frontier. This series is more than just a collection of dates and names. It's an exploration of the human condition under extreme pressure. If you've watched until this very last moment, you are part of a rare group that seeks the deep truth behind the headlines. What story should we silence the myths for next? Is there another figure of the West or a dark chapter of history you want us to investigate? Let us know in the comments. Your suggestions drive the direction of this channel. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join the witness of silence. The hunt for Jesse James might be over, but the shadows of history are infinite. If you enjoyed this saga, you won't want to miss our next production, where we dive into the life of the man who finally brought order to the chaos, the legendary lawman Bass Reeves. You can click the video on your screen right now to start that journey. The trail doesn't end here. It just leads to a new horizon. Until next time, remember, the loudest stories are often the ones that hide the deepest secrets.